Thank you very much for coming along on this very beautiful but chilly Monday morning here for the UNSW Speak Out. And the topic today is on forced migration as part of the UNSW Diversity Festival. My name is Councillor Philippa Veach. I'm the Mayor of Randwick City Council, and I'm really delighted to join with you today and to hear from the wonderful speakers on the panel. And I don't have their surnames written down, but we do have Madeline, Shireen, Parisa, Francis and Abang, who come from backgrounds from Iran, Lebanon and South Sudan. I would first like to acknowledge that we're meeting on the unceded land of the Bidjigal people and pay my very deepest respects to elders past and present and to all Aboriginal people who will be in attendance here today. This always was and always will be First Nations land, Aboriginal land, and here in Randwick I feel very honoured and privileged to know many of the elders, particularly from the La Perouse community, who provide that incredible ground of knowledge and love and support. And when you listen to a welcome to country from people such as Auntie Barbara or Auntie Lola or Auntie Maxine, you do feel welcome, you do feel safe and supported by the ancestors as you move, live and work in this wonderful city of Randwick City Council. Today is a really important day. I'm really delighted that UNSW is putting on this diversity festival, and I'm very, very interested to hear from the speakers from their direct experience and what we can do as allies to support people with experiences of forced migration. There are many people who are in this situation in Australia, but I would like to see more, because I know that sounds a bit weird, but forced migration and immigration and the status of asylum seekers in Australia has been an incredibly contested political space for as long as I can remember, at least, you know, in my living memory, two or three decades, and obviously probably going back to the very beginning of colonisation in this country. We know, you know, I've personally, you know, have strong recollections of the setup of terrible camps, you know, in remote locations, and the conversations and protests and things around those. And, you know, of course they preceded the horrific Pacific solution, and we still have many people languishing in offshore processing or here on temporary visas. And of course there was a horrific story that came out a couple of weeks ago of a young man who unfortunately took his life in very severe circumstances. So we need to do everything in our power to raise this issue, to raise awareness, to call on all levels of government to support people who have fled conflict from no matter where it is, whether it be Sudan, whether it be Gaza, whether it be Ukraine. So I'm very much looking forward to hearing from the panellists this morning, and I hope you'll join me in welcoming them. Thank you.
I'd also like to show my respects and acknowledge the Bedigal people, who are the traditional custodians of the land on which this campus is situated, and to elders past and present. Good morning, and thank you everyone for joining us today in person and online for this special Speak Out panel on forced migration as part of UNSW's Diversity Festival 2024. As we sit here today, an estimated 120 million people have been forced to leave their homes as a result of persecution, conflict, violence, human rights violations and events seriously disturbing public order. And many more have been forced to leave due to the effects of climate change and disasters. While some crises, like those in Ukraine and the Middle East, fill our headlines, others go seemingly unnoticed, including what has been called the forgotten war in Sudan, which has displaced some 10 million people in less than 18 months. In Sudan, as elsewhere, the vast majority of displaced people remain within their country, either by choice or because they simply cannot leave. But others do cross borders and travel, taking various routes to seek safety in countries like Australia. Some come as asylum seekers or refugees, others as students, workers, family members. Here at UNSW, many members of our community are affected by displacement. Some, like our first three panellists today, had to make the difficult decisions themselves to leave their countries of origin. But displacement also impacts Australians who are born and have lived here their entire lives, especially when it affects friends or members of their families and communities abroad. With this reality in mind, this panel will centre around people in the UNSW community with lived experience of forced migration and aim to foster a deeper understanding of their stories. And we will also learn about UNSW's Justice, Inclusion, Access, or JEINA community. So without further ado, it is my great pleasure to introduce the four extraordinary women on our panel today. The first three are here to generously share with us their experiences of displacement and dislocation from their countries of origin. Dr. Parisa Glass is Director of Operations at the Clinical Research Unit at UNSW Medicine and Health and Director of Innovation and Enterprise at the George Institute for Global Health. She has a PhD, an MBA, and over 20 years of experience across healthcare, medical research, and higher education. Abang Anade Otho is an educator, speaker, and pragmatist who is passionate about using her experience as a refugee of the South Sudan civil war to help others become initiators of change rather than victims of circumstance. Abang is a board member of the Asylum Seeker Centre, and her work has gained widespread attention both in Australia and internationally, including in the New York Times, on SBS Insight and 7 News, and in the Canberra Times. I'm told she has also shared stages with the likes of Olivia Newton-John, Delta Goodrem, Ian Thorpe, and Adam Liao, so the bar is set high for the rest of us today. And Shireen Al-Shalah is an economist, solicitor, teaching fellow, and doctoral researcher with over 20 years' experience in senior policy roles. She completed her postgraduate economics degree at the London School of Economics and Political Science and a postgraduate law degree at UNSW, where she's now completing her PhD in the Faculty of Law and Justice. And finally, rounding out our panel today, we are fortunate to have Frances Voon, the Executive Manager of the Andrew and Renata Cowdell Centre for International Refugee Law at UNSW Sydney. Frances has worked in refugee operations around the world with the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, UN World Food Programme, and Jesuit Refugee Service. In 2021, she was named amongst the 40 under 40 most influential Asian Australians, winning the Community and Advocacy Not-for-Profit category, and she was the winner of the Advanced Global Australian Social Impact Award in 2022 for her leadership in advancing the rights of refugees. Please join me in welcoming our panellists today. The focus of today's panel is understanding the experience of forced migration, but before we delve into that part of your stories, I wanted to ask you each a bit about your respective accomplishments. Dr. Glass, if we can start with you. You have built an impressive career as a woman in leadership in healthcare and medical research. Talk to us a little bit about what it is that you do, and is this the professional path that you saw for yourself when you were younger?
Thank you so much, and thank you, everybody, for being here. Yes, I always loved medicine, and I always wanted to do something in science and medicine. So when I had the opportunity to study and further my education in Australia, that was always on my side. And what I do now, I work with an incredible team at UNSW managing clinical trials and clinical research. I meet with wonderful researchers. I haven't met anybody really famous, so I'm jealous, but all the scientists and clinicians and researchers that I've worked with for the past 16 years, they're all wonderful, and I learn from them every day. So I feel privileged to actually be part of the medicine and health community.
Thank you. Abang, your list of professional accomplishments is extensive. As a refugee advocate, you speak with politicians, you're featured in the media, you're a national ambassador for the Refugee Council of Australia, you've taught in communities across Australia, and now you're also writing a memoir. You're a mother, you were formerly a model working in international fashion, You clearly have many talents, but what is one of the areas of your work about which you feel the most proud?
Thank you so much for the question, and what a welcome that we've received today. Thank you. I think one of the biggest accomplishments is my education and being an educator. I arrived in Australia as a refugee, having escaped, survived 2 civil wars and losing my family. And then I was in Australia with less than 6 years formal education. So I'm very, very proud to have been able to work really hard and achieve my education, because that has really given me the opportunity to work with incredible students as a teacher. Mind you, it has been very tough job as a teacher, but every year I was saying, this is my last year, and I've lasted 10 years so far. So, so yes, I would say that is something that I'm quite proud of.
Shireen, your doctoral research explores international legal frameworks for the protection of refugee cultural heritage and cultural objects in particular. What is refugee cultural heritage, and what prompted you to pursue a PhD on this topic?
Thank you for the question. And so as Madeleine was saying, I was an economist for 20 years before deciding to become a lawyer. And I decided to become a lawyer because I was frustrated by refugee injustice in Australia. And so I wanted to be a refugee lawyer. And now I'm researching refugee cultural heritage because I think cultural heritage is such a big part of who a refugee is. And often it is ignored in the discourse. So it's not only about survival, it's also about living, and it's about life. And as someone from a forced migration background, I know how objects can be so meaningful and such a big part of who you are. And so I look at, basically refugee cultural heritage is anything cultural as an object or as a ritual or a monument that a refugee identifies with as their own. So, which includes the experience of being a refugee and the journey of being a refugee. And that's what I look at. I look at how international law would protect that and would give refugees rights to those objects. Thank you.
And Frances, you've worked in displacement settings around the world. Could you talk to us a bit about what the Cowdell Centre is and what motivates you to do the work that you do there?
Of course, the Cowdell Centre is a centre based here at UNSW in the Faculty of Law and Justice. It was established in 2013, so over a decade ago, to undertake rigorous research and principled policy engagement, public engagement on forced migration and refugee law, and really in response to a public discourse discussion about refugee issues that was so dominated by misinformation and heated political rhetoric, and in which the human experiences and impacts of displacement were really being lost to sort of a populist politics around this. And so we are a non-partisan, independent centre that seeks to inject evidence and principle into that discussion through undertaking research and through translating that and sharing that with everybody who needs it, whether that be policymakers, lawyers, civil society, and members of the general public as well, to try and have a more constructive conversation that can lead to real solutions and humane responses. So I'm here not as a person who has lived experience of displacement myself, but as a person who's spent my career seeking to work in solidarity and alongside people with lived experience of displacement here in Australia, but also in a range of contexts in Bangladesh, in Jordan, South Sudan, and also with the UN Refugee Agency in its headquarters in Geneva. And have been led to that, I suppose, through my own sense of empathy with what it means to not belong. As a child of migrants myself, my parents migrated here from Malaysia as students, and as a person who is really committed to the idea that we should live in a society where everyone has the opportunity to thrive, regardless of where you come from. And so that is a part of what's led me to do the work that I do. And you know, in my experience with working alongside forcibly displaced communities around the world, one of the things that really stands out is, first of all, the diversity of those experiences, but also the incredible kind of resilience and agency and skills and competencies that people in those situations bring, and the deep understanding that they have of both what the problems are and also what the potential solutions are. And I'm really passionate about bringing those perspectives into our conversations and to the processes through which we make decisions to forge solutions there.
Thank you, Frances. That leads us beautifully into the next set of questions, which are about promoting understanding and empathy about forced migration. Parisa, if we come back to you, what does it mean to you to have lived experience of displacement?
I guess before I start, I like to warn people and apologise for what might come out, and you know, it might sound like trauma dumping, but yes, so I apologise in advance. You would hear things that it's not going to be pleasant. So I I came to Australia as a refugee from Iran, and I escaped Iran through the border without my family. I was 15 years old, and whenever people hear that bit, they kind of really excited. They go, well, how long was that trip, and how many mountains did you cross, and, you know, were you scared? Because that bit of the story is sort of exciting for people, and they go, wow, you know, how did you go about it? Nobody really wants to understand why you did it, the previous, you know, the life that led you to decide that, you know, you got to make that decision as a young girl, and your family making the decision that life is no longer for you, you need to leave. So I might not look at, but I'm old enough to have seen, I was very young when the revolution in Iran happened, the upheaval, and the ultra-conservatives took power. And once that happened, in the chaos, gates of hell opened. And the first people that got caught in that were religious minorities. And I was born in a Baha'i family. And, you know, we lived in the capital, so it was a little bit easier. But a lot of families lost their lives. They would burn houses. They would, you know, kill men in front of their families. You convert or you die, essentially. I was quite young. My mother was pregnant, and our house was surrounded by men chanting hateful slogans of kill their men, basically, and women and children to do whatever you wish. And I must say the hatred that drives people to that point, it's not something that happens overnight, it's gradual. So whenever I talk to people, I say, be mindful, be very careful of leaders that talk hate, because it always starts from small conversations of hate and not including people and just making a certain group of people into demons, and that's where it starts. But it expands from there. So that was very scary for me. You know, that night nothing happened to us, but I remember sleeping in the car with my parents many nights after that, and we moved around quite a lot. So you feel the fear that you're going to die, somebody is going to come and get you, is with you, and you feel it in your stomach, kind of that fear that you're going to be targeted. And this wasn't irrational, because a lot of people got executed simply because of their faith. And because the Baha'i faith is, the philosophy is that you turn the other cheek, the only way for us to actually confront this demon was to not convert. It was our rebellion against it, and they knew that. So this, I guess, assault was all-encompassing. It was, you know, you kill the leaders, you try and convert the children in school. So I remember at school when they found out, you know, when I was in junior high, you know, the first thing they ask you is what religion you are, and I said, and everything changed after that. So it was really unpleasant for a few years, and I felt really isolated for a long time, and my only sort of friend at those during junior high school was another girl, and her father had been executed because he was a high-ranking officer in the previous government. Some days I would go to school and it was, you know, pleasant, and then other days the principal would call me in, and I was really small, petite girl, and you know, my parents would tell me, look, don't ruffle any feathers, just don't talk about the community, talk about yourself, listen and be brave. Just be brave, just listen. And he would interrogate me, and this would go on for a long time. And you know, the parents, they would throw them out of their jobs. There was no Baha'is that had any jobs, and essentially economically, socially, and there's isolation. But that didn't stop. It didn't stop with the Baha'i community. The gates of hell, you know, whenever there is oppression, the oppressors are not satisfied with one group of people. So as soon as there is resistance, then it expands. So it, you know, and I always say to people that evil starts from ignorance, and then it continues through fear and through chaos. So we have to be mindful of that. So to continue their existence, they knew they had to impact the next generation, and women were the central pillar of the next generations to come. So they had to disempower women because they're mothers of children of the future. So those they straight away they started attacking women. And I'm wearing very bright lipstick on purpose today because the first thing that they would do, because women of Iran were free, the first thing that they would do is that they would go around and they would say, you have to take the lipstick off your lips. And women that resisted, they would slash their lips with razor. So the fear that they would inject into the streets to make it as unsafe for women as possible forced women to actually put the hijab on by force, and they've been resisting it for 45 years. And you know, you see woman life freedom. It's nothing to do with hijab. It's nothing to do with makeup. It's actually to do with everything that they did to women after that. They disempowered them. They took away all their rights, and they second-class citizens essentially in society. I can go on and on. There's not enough hours in a day to go through the grotesque human rights violations against women that's happening to this day in Iran. But, you know, and women continue. Women are resilient. We continue, we fight, we talk about our experiences. And I must say it's taken me many years, because when I came to Australia, I decided I need to forget, to move on. I was in year 10, 11, and 12. There was enough problems as a refugee to survive here. I didn't want to feel the isolation, so I had to forget. But I've forced myself to remember and to talk about it, because I think it's a really, really important thing to do.
Thank you for sharing part of your story with us. Anyone that has had the privilege of speaking with any of the particularly Parisa, Abang and Shireen on this panel will know that you could listen to them all day. So hopefully this is just the beginning of conversations with each of you, and we can continue long after today. Abang, your work requires you also to speak a lot about your refugee experience, reflecting on it, sharing it with others. Are there key parts of your story that you feel are particularly important to share with others?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think the act of storytelling is quite important, because what I realized is that I've been speaking to, I only started doing this last year and this year, and speaking to 4-year-olds to 8-year-olds, and they all asked the same questions. How did you manage? What strategies did you use? You know, and I realized that people don't have to go through the same journey as me, but they can really connect with aspects of my journey. Obviously, my journey has been a very, very difficult journey. From the age of 5, I was forcefully separated from my family. So when I was born, I was very oblivious to life. I was born to a middle-class family. My father was a university professor, and my mom was a secretary. We lived by the Nile, and it was very beautiful. But then my life was completely uprooted and changed in an instant. So I became very sick with malaria, and I was taken to my father, because my father left his job as a university professor in economics, because he felt that he could make a difference by becoming a politician. And so our lives completely changed. My father became a politician, and then he was put in the capital city. At the time it was Khartoum, because the country was one. So when I became very sick with malaria and I lost my young brother to cholera, my mom made the decision to take me to my father. And I did not know that that would be the last time I would ever see my mom as a child. We arrived in Khartoum, and then my father was facing his first assassination attempt, and so we had to escape. So we escaped the country, and then we arrived in a neighboring country in Ethiopia. And my father left me there, unfortunately, because he was a leader. He really was standing and supporting the people of Sudan, especially minorities, women and children. And he was against the use of child soldiers. They'd done terrible, terrible things, including one of my brothers who was taken to participate and to be a child soldier. So my father had a lot of responsibilities. He left me in Ethiopia thinking that I was safe. However, I wasn't safe, because another civil war broke out in Ethiopia. And then I had to escape as a child and into the fierce battle back into Sudan, another part of Sudan, in the middle of the civil war. So I was in that war for many, many years until I was 11, and then I had to escape again to another country in Kenya. And so it's obviously a very long story, but so many things happened. I arrived in Kenya, and for the first time as an 11-year-old, I was able to go to school, and I could not believe the impact that had. However, that was short-lived. At the age of 14, my father was murdered, and I was left alone. I was left homeless, and then I had to go to a refugee camp in a very remote place in Kakuma. And I tell you what, it's not easy being in a refugee camp as a teenager on your own. It has been a very, very difficult journey in that place. However, I was given the opportunity to come to Australia as a refugee, and I arrived here as just before my 18th birthday, and I had really big hopes and dreams, and I had to use a lot of resilience, because being in Australia alone with no family is not an easy task. And the good news is that, so, you know, because obviously I have to leave it with some good news, I was able to search for my family, for my mom and my siblings. And after 17 years of separation, I was able to bring my mom and my siblings to Australia for the first time. And they're here now, and they're going through their own journeys, but quite remarkable. My mom, who's turning 70 next year, she decided to go to university because she wanted to prove to herself. She said, I might never get a job, but I'm gonna do it. And so, so my journey continues. It hasn't stopped, obviously, as a mom as well, and now writing my memoir and developing this strategy that, you know, that I'll share a little bit about with you, and, you know, how I was able to move from survival into coping and now into thriving. That is something that I'm really passionate about, and that is why I speak to people, because I want to give people hope that despite, no matter what people go through, we will always go through challenges, but it's what we make it to be and how we interpret the situations that happen to us.
Thank you very much, Abang. And yes, we will return shortly to discuss your Buckets of Hope strategy. Shireen, to you next. How do you understand the concept of a homeland and manage the constant pull between the country you left and the country that is now your home?
Thank you for this question. So first, I also want to share with you how it took me a long time to reckon with the fact that I'm also from a forced migration background, because I came here on a different route. I came here on a visa, and now I'm a citizen. And so I thought, okay, I'm a migrant. And then I realized, did I want to leave my home country? No. Can I go back? No. And so I'm a forced migrant. And more than that, my country, Lebanon, is not the same one that I left. And it's constantly being destroyed in every sense. And that's my attachment to cultural heritage, is that I know that, when I go back, it's not that same one. And maybe that's my desire of looking at how I can bring my objects, because I know that, they would not be there. They would be destroyed, and there's no way to go back, and that's part of who I am. In terms of what's my homeland, I'm in between. I don't think, Australia is my home now. I have 2 young children here. But then also Lebanon is also my homeland. And so I am between the two. And storytelling for me, it's not only telling stories to others, it's also telling them to my children, because I want them to also be their stories, since they are my stories. And I think they are our stories, and it's very important for us to connect with our heritage. And heritage doesn't have to be aesthetically pleasing. It could also be something about war. I lived through a civil war. My house burnt during the war. I had to move a lot. I was raised by a single mom. We lived in one room from house to house. We only always had the one room. We were all in that room. And that's part of who I am and who many Lebanese families are. And I wanted to be also part of who they are. And part of it is engaging. So telling the story so that people engage, my children engage, and then they keep thinking about it, they empathize with it, and then maybe eventually they do something about it to change the way it is. Yeah.
Thank you, Shireen. Francis, these last 3 answers have shown a range of experiences and relationships with the concept of displacement. From your experience working in refugee protection around the world, is this commonly what you've seen as well, that this kind of diversity of experience?
Thanks, Madeline. Absolutely. And I think, the first thing I want to say is thank you to Parissa, Abang and Shireen for sharing their experiences here. It's not easy to share these stories. You don't owe it to anybody to tell these stories. It's an act of generosity that you do that. And as someone who's hearing them, I think it's really for all of us to say thank you for being so generous with those experiences. And of course, they are really different. And I think as someone who is seeking to be an ally to people who have experienced displacement, we ask ourselves, what does it mean for us to sort of be a good listener in these situations? And I think there's a temptation in all of us to kind of put a label on this. It's hero or brave or resilient, and or to flatten this out into a sort of a victim stereotype or a hero stereotype, or and I think it's incumbent on us to sort of try and resist that. Flattening out people's stories into a single label, because we can see, first of all, that amongst even just the 3 experiences we're hearing here, there's so much richness and diversity, but also that none of these women is just a refugee, you know, the experience of displacement is one aspect of what they've experienced, but, you know, they're also experts, professionals, parents, siblings, members of the community, you know, in so many other ways. And so it's also important for us to remember that, you know, the refugee label doesn't necessarily encompass the whole of a person's experience, and also that within that there are so many different experiences there. But of course the thing that does draw together you know, all of these and the many stories that I've heard in a range of different contexts is, of course, that experience of having been forced to leave. So not having had a real choice about to stay, or finding that you know, that the choices that were available to them were really wicked ones. And I think also as a listener, you know, it's incumbent on us to think of, you know, to seek to empathise with that. And we've all been in experiences where we've had to make difficult decisions. And so, you know, seeking to also build bridges and to draw on where we can imagine ourselves in those situations as well, whilst also recognising that they're difficult. And so taking care of yourself as well, and being aware of where things might be difficult for you and make you feel uncomfortable, because it's also your responsibility as a listener and as a would-be ally to kind of try to be conscious of those things as well.
Thank you, Frances. Let's dig back into that idea of stories and storytelling, which has already come up for a few of you now. Parisa, what do you see as the role for storytelling in making sense of displacement for yourself and also in how you communicate with others?
Thanks. I guess a lot of these stories, like you can read it in a book, and you know, human history is full of grotesque things that people have done to each other. You can read about it, but it's a different feeling when you actually sit down with people who have gone through it and you relate to them as a human, because at the end of the day I always think, look, it's just probability of birth, where, you know, we are born out of a mother, and, you know, we live off the land, and if we are lucky we make lots of good friends and we have a good life, we contribute, and then we die. That's just the way it is, and it's how we live with others, the communities we make. And I think that's part of that storytelling, is that we listen to each other, we hear each other, and sometimes we don't agree with each other, and sometimes we think that we could do things better, but it's about compassion and empathy, and about being understanding that people go through different experiences, and you know, the human sort of culture is full of different colours, and we're very colourful, and hopefully we're going in the right direction of one day we all live in peace and harmony, and understand that this is a very, very short life. And again, just going back, the storytelling is part of that, for us to, you know, understand that we are equal, and we want to go through this journey as painlessly as possible, and hopefully leave the world better for our children.
Thank you. Abang, what about you? What does storytelling mean for you? And perhaps you could share with us a bit about the Buckets of Hope initiative.
Thank you. So I think storytelling is really profound. It really allows us to connect deeper with other humans, and also it really helps that dehumanizing of people, which is why there's so many conflicts, because humans have decided to create this difference about themselves and just commit terrible atrocities on each other. So that's why I decided to start sharing my story. I never really thought that I had a story. I thought, you know, I just had a journey that everyone goes through. But then I realized when I was teaching for the past 10 years and talking to my students about resilience and how they can overcome difficult challenges, because a lot of young people really face mental health crisis and so many difficult things. And I tell them that you don't have to go through a war, two civil war, losing your family, or, you know, like I hear you and I understand what you're going through. And then I talk to them about strategies that I used as a child. And I could not believe it. They were so inspired, and it helped them get better. And so I thought, oh, maybe actually I do have something that I can contribute, you know. Maybe my story is actually not a terrible thing. Maybe it's something that I can truly use my pain and my suffering and what I've gone through to turn it into this hope, you know, and opportunities, and to help others. And that's why I truly share my journey, because I even if I can help one person, but I have helped so many students, and so I believe in that. So when I was going through my refugee journey as a 5-year-old, memory played big tricks on me. My family were what they looked like, and the memories was fading, and that really frightened me as a child. And I had to create something in order for my mind and my body to cope with the trauma that I was going through. And so the concept of colors became so important. That's why I'm wearing colors today, as you can see my nails and everything. So I remembered my mom, my aunties, my grandmother, they used to carry these colored buckets with water and food, and it was always very joyful. So I held on to that because I knew that I would never forget colors, even though I was forgetting what my family looked like because I was very young when I was forcefully separated. I then imagine and compartmentalize my emotions in these colored buckets, very colorful. So the yellow was representing, you know, the beautiful memories of my family, my mom, my siblings, the mango tree, you know, the sunlight across the Nile, you know, and, you know, so that became my happy memories. And I realized that it was very important what I told myself. In order for me to survive, I had to tell myself wonderful things of what was happening, and that color represented that. And then the red color was for warnings, and the reason why I came up with that was simply because of the bloodshed and everything that was going around me. But also, most importantly, it was to trust my intuition, because there were moments where I needed to trust my intuition to be able to survive the day or survive the second, because chaos was happening. And what you said earlier on about chaos, that's what war is, you know? It's chaos and bloodshed, and nothing good comes out of it. So I needed to trust that intuition. And the green color was for learning new skills and opportunities. And I've truly embraced that character, you know, and I still do it. Every single day I find opportunity. In crisis, I find opportunities. In difficulties, I find opportunities. In pain and suffering, no matter what I'm going through. And that is something that I am quite, you know, good at. You know, and I've just seen my friend here, so she knows that I share about that creation of opportunities all the time. So, you know, the black bucket was simply for resilience. And for me, I saw myself as this earth, you know, Mother Earth. And despite everything that was going through, the earth was still there. I wake up in the morning and touch the earth, and I knew that the earth was there. And so those 4 colors became my friends, and they kept me alive. And most importantly, in the green bucket, I felt that it was very important to help. And by helping other people, and which is what I tell my students and I tell people, have you thought of beautiful things today that you're grateful for? You know, have you trusted your intuition with what is going on? Have you helped someone? Have you found one person to help today? Because that will make you feel better. It takes you out of your internal dialogue, you know, like it takes you out of the external and into your internal dialogue. And that's really helpful. And have you thought about what ways you can actually be resilient, what strategies you could do today to help yourself? Because we have to take that opportunity, and we can't always wait for someone else to help us. And then naturally, people will come and help. So that's in a simplified way what my strategy was. It was very simple, but yet profound. And now I'm actually in the process of developing it to help communities and to help people to be able, and I'm not saying it's the only strategy out there in the world, but it's something that perhaps people can embed in their own lives to help them get better and thrive and not just survive.
Thank you, Abang. I'm sure I speak for everyone when I say that I am looking forward to your memoir being finished, and will be reading that immediately. So I commend it to everyone already, even though it is still a work in progress. Shireen, what does storytelling mean for you, and perhaps how does technology play into that? Because even though Lebanon is geographically far away, we've spoken before about how you wake up in the morning and thanks to technology on your phone, the media is there live, there are people on the ground posting photos. How does that also play into sort of storytelling for you?
Thank you for the question. So in terms of storytelling, I'll start with saying how I thought in Lebanon, like you actively forget the story to ritualize your resilience. If I'm always remembering what was happening, it would make it difficult. And so we did that actively. My mom would keep telling us, we're okay, fine, let's forget it and move on, forget it and move on. And then coming here, I think I'm now the story, it's actually actively remembering the story, because it's reckoning with who I am and what I've gone through, and everything that I'm going through today. And so the role of technology is very important, because news from Lebanon is not really reported so much, not all of it, despite having a big Arab and Lebanese population. And so I get my news from WhatsApp. I wake up in the morning, I check, I'll have messages, and then I'll go on Lebanese websites and I'll find out the news. And not being part of the mainstream story makes me feel like I'm not part of the mainstream. Like it makes you're suffering in isolation. You're going through the events. You feel like you're the only one going through. You have to tell people that this happened. They're not told unless you tell them. So there becomes this responsibility, kind of like holding the story and telling the story. And then what happens when you tell someone the story? I think, like, I'm so happy Frances started talking about how you take the story. So telling the story maybe is an act of generosity. Maybe sometimes you can't even help telling it because you just have to tell it, offload it. And then what does the other person do with your story? It's still your story in a way, but you also want them to empathize and you also want them to engage. So I think I'm still between this in terms of storytelling, right? I'm trying to remember, I'm trying to reckon, and I'm telling the story, not sure exactly what I want from the other person when I tell them the story, but maybe just to feel less isolated. And to build a community.
Thank you very much. We've only got a few minutes left, but in order to perhaps leave us in an optimistic frame of mind, I'm sure there are many listening today who think I've been very moved by these stories. How can I leave today and do something about it? What's something that I can do or that I can change or that I can share in the world to honour the generosity of the women today who've shared their stories? So with that in mind, we might start with Frances and we'll work our way down. What are your thoughts about what members of the audience can do to be more welcoming, inclusive, understanding and empathetic of people with lived experience of displacement?
Thank you. There is something that all of us can do. We're all a member of, families, communities. We're part of this UNSW community, and we're also citizens and, participate in a broader kind of larger conversation. And in all of those things, we have the opportunity to participate as people who are trying to walk alongside people with lived experience of displacement. I think there are ways. So first of all, just in terms of the sorts of conversations we're having today, I think being committed to engaging in a respectful, curious way, with people who we encounter who are willing to share their lived experience of displacement is important. And as Shireen sort of hinted at, there's not necessarily a right, way to respond, and it's a human interaction, but ensuring that, the person is comfortable with to share, not necessarily, one disclosure doesn't necessarily mean, that you're being invited to probe, other difficult details, but also to engage in an open and respectful way with that. It goes a huge way to helping to ensure that these experiences are seen and heard and in a context in which, they have otherwise been made so invisible by the sorts of policies that Philippa talked about in the opening. But there are also opportunities to be engaged as members of this UNSW community. At the Caldor Centre, we have a mentoring program for students with lived experience of forced displacement, and I know we'll also hear about JEINA, which is a wonderful new initiative, particularly for women with experience of displacement here at UNSW. The Caldor Centre's mentoring program is a global program for people who are early career scholars in the field of forced displacement across any discipline, but concerning forced displacement. And we match them with a mentor to work one-on-one, but also peer-to-peer across the group to help essentially create a supportive community of fellow scholars in the field. So that's one thing that we can do. And also just to be active in sharing, accurate information, but also kind of, real human experiences. And that's not something that's only the responsibility of people who have lived experience of forced displacement, but for all of us, it's an important thing that we can do as allies.
Thank you. Shireen.
So what can people do? So showing up today is one thing, listening to this, listening. So when someone's telling you the story, to listen, to be there, to show up. I will let Peresa talk more about our JEINA project. I think globally in the community, ask for more, know more, read more. Learn about this. I know some of these things are happening in different parts of the world, but we are all human beings, we are all equal. And we all have our different experiences that we can relate with. So I would say, show up and listen and engage.
And I think, I agree with everything that you have said. I think it's very important to identify inequality as well when it happens. It is something that a lot of people from forced migration struggle with. I certainly know that it was quite challenging, even getting through to a university, trying to get through to courses. There's just a lot of obstacles, and I'm not saying, obviously, that things should be made easier, but it's just to be made accessible, because this is one of the things that that it's not just asking the question of, what can you do as an ally, or what can I do as a person of lived experience? Sometimes there's a huge burden, and I sometimes feel like I have to advocate and be out there doing a lot, and it can take its toll in terms of and just having allies who actually can identify that inequity and take action, active action to prevent that. So it's fantastic. But thank you so much for your support.
I always come at things by, we go, what's the problem? How are you going to kind of solve it? The entrepreneurial mindset. And I see my colleagues from the entrepreneurial space. The problem, we know what the problems are, and there's a lot of refugee, forced migrant women in New South Wales, and they want to come to UNSW. What can we do? It's not about you feeling sorry for me. It's about how we're going to make the world better so others don't go through the experiences we went through. So that's essentially what we want to do through JEINA project, is actually create a community of forced migrant background as well as others, because we want this to be a dialogue, but also to provide practical support for women from forced migrant backgrounds so they don't just survive, they thrive. So there is an event tomorrow as well. If you want to learn more about JEINA and what we do have a social gathering tomorrow at 9:30 in this room. And there's going to be music, so please come and spend a bit of time with us and learn about JEINA. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Could I invite you all, please, to share a very grateful round of applause to our panellists today for having shared their experiences. If you are around, please do come tomorrow to have a cup of tea, a bite to eat, listen to the music and to learn more about JEINA. And now I'd like to invite, please, the Mayor to give her closing remarks on today's session. Thank you, Philippa.
Well, that was an absolutely extraordinary morning and opportunity to listen to the accounts and testimony of the speakers today, of Parisa, Abang and Shireen. I would just like to share my absolute gratitude for you for sharing what are incredibly difficult experiences, and most of us just would not, imagine what people could live through. I think the closing questions were a really interesting one, what we can do as individuals and as a community, and Council does have a really important role to play, and I would urge everyone to call on your councillors and mayors and representatives of all levels of government to see what they can do. My background is in the visual arts, and one of my day jobs is down at the Boomgate Gallery at Long Bay Jail, just down the road at Anzac Parade. And one of the interesting things you find working in the arts, and for me it's visual arts, is that the space that it opens up for challenging and difficult conversations. So I'm very much one to promote arts of all kind, whether it's storytelling, performance, visual arts, dance and music, of course, as a way, as a little bit of a safe space sometimes to engage people, and it's very good for the practitioners themselves, and it's very interesting for audiences, and a really important way to build connections. That was something that came up from a panel on a recent local government conference in Canberra, where you have councillors and mayors coming from all over Australia, and that is one area of research that one of the panellists present there, I can't recall their name unfortunately, was saying that councils can do, because they found that this particular person was saying that these kind of events and spaces tick a whole lot of boxes. They promote inclusion and participation, particularly for people who may be experiencing social isolation. And also it's very much shown to promote mental health and well-being. So this is where local government can really play a big part. And, certainly at Randwick Council, we're trying to build up our spaces for people to come and use. There are grants available, and we have different programs and events happening all the time in committees. And so one thing you might be interested in, the new council will be, the voting's still being, votes are still being counted literally as we speak, but the new council will be inducted, will commence next month. There'll be different committees, and we have a number of advisory committees, and that might be something to keep your eye on, to sign up to our council email bulletin. It has lots of great information. My year as mayor is coming to an end, but I've certainly tried to engage with UNSW as one of the major stakeholders, employers and bodies in our community. I'm here on campus pretty much every other week, visiting students and staff in the different faculties and just trying to learn about what they're doing. And so I'm very much interested in seeing how we can continue to build connections between UNSW and council and community, because it is a really wonderful, diverse community. So please call, demand, demand your politicians to work for your benefit. It can sometimes be a not terribly inclusive space, and I acknowledge the significant barriers that many people would feel perhaps of engaging with government at that level. But we're here to serve you, and please come and tell us what you would like to do. So, and look out for those grants and so on. They're advertised once or twice a year. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you to everyone as we go out into the day. I think the main message is to call out and address any form of discrimination and hate where you see it. And thank you again. Hopefully we see many of you here tomorrow for the morning tea. Thank you.